Hi, and welcome to my workshop for what is going to probably be a long multi-part series spanning at least a year. About a decade ago, I had the idea of building a scale model of Mountain Park, the park where I basically grew up, in Holyoke, Mass, and long gone now. It's 31 years the park has been closed. And I couldn't find a place to put it because at the time I was trying to work in HO scale. And HO scale would have made the park about 28 feet long. And nobody I could find was interested in displaying a model that long. So I basically shelved the idea and didn't think of it again until about a year ago. I was approached by Charles Lotspeak, who is the head of Heritage State Parks Visitor Center in Holyoke. And they were interested in getting some more historical displays of the immigrant populations in Holyoke and the history of Holyoke in general. And he brought me on board to sort of field stuff about Mountain Park. And I brought up the idea to him of creating a scale model. And he was very interested in that, but he said they didn't have enough room to put a 28-foot model. Even an N-gauge model would have been about 18 feet long. He said he had about 8 feet to work with. So that was my goal, is to try to make a model about that size. So I started off with a ground plan, and I'll show you a close-up of this. A ground plan of the park that was taken, an aerial shot that was taken in 1962. It was taken for the construction of Interstate 91, which was bisecting the park's property. So they took it for survey purposes, and it is the best overhead view of the park that I've come across because it was taken straight down, so there was no parallax. Well, what I did is I printed it out on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and then I took my architect scale and I just began playing around with my architect scale, saying, well, what happens if I put it at 1/4 inch to a foot, and what happens if I put it at 3/32 to a foot? And I ended up on 1.5 inches to a foot. And what I noticed when I lined it up is that if right at this point I cut off the park, this area on the right would have been the ballroom and the tap room. If I cut off the park right at that point, I had an exact 6 foot by 2 foot table that I could put it on. So that arbitrarily became my starting point. I said, okay, let's do it from, that era without the tap room and ballroom and make it about 6 feet by 2 feet. Once I settled on those dimensions, I got myself a 6 foot by 2 foot sheet of plywood. It's actually 23 inches. And I covered it with homosote, like I would do for a model railroad setup. And then I proceeded to locate on my drawing over here, what happens if I take my 1.5 inch scale and move it here. And if I look at that, that makes it about 2 inches in from the edge is where the roller coaster would start, the Mountain Flyer. And I could also go here and I could say, okay, well, to help scale, let's go at 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, all the way down, mark lines right down so that I can help myself scale as I'm setting things up. So that's how I began, just doing it that way and getting a rough approximation of where everything would fall. I started over here on the south end of the park with the biggest building, the Clam Bake Pavilion, which is attached to a thing they call the towers. And then I built up all the other buildings. The merry-go-round building came next because that was the next biggest building, the whip building, the Dodgem car building, and the roller coaster, of course, which spanned the entire length of the park. And I have a blueprint of the actual Mountain Park roller coaster. So I was able to scale that quite precisely when I laid it out. Then on the back row here, which they used to call Arcade Row, you had the Dinosaur Den Funhouse, which was flanked on each side by 2 concessions, and the Pirates Den, and then the office area, which also had 2 games, and then the skee ball. And I decided to set the era around 1980, which is when I started working at the park, when they still had the Out of This World Funhouse, which was an amazing structure. So I put that in there right next to the arcade, and this is the station for the roller coaster. And then way at the far north end is the miniature golf course, which was intersected by the miniature railroad that went around through a tunnel up here and then out this way. There are 2 restrooms over here. The Sky Ride, which was in place starting in 1972, the Sky Ride posed an interesting challenge because it went way off into the picnic grove and then down to what used to be a zoo down there. And I obviously couldn't do the whole thing, but I wanted to show it. So I simply cut it off at the second supporting post here. So you have the main station, and I'll have a few cars hanging on the cables here, and you'll just assume it goes off in that direction. So this became my layout. Once I had the buildings, I began, adding to it and putting in the rides using a compass, because almost all the rides had a circular layout. So, all of Kittyland was filled in, the Ferris wheel, Tempest, Tilt-A-Whirl, Satellite. Then all the little concession buildings. So this was the cotton candy stand, Midway Lunch. We have the birthday game over here, the glass game over here, the gypsy booths, the grocery game, the dart game. So pretty much the entire park is now complete. And the next step in this will be to begin sanding this down. The park was on the side of Mount Tom in Holyoke, and this whole area of the Midway was backfill. They basically took tons and tons and tons of sand and leveled out this area so that you wouldn't have this continual slope as it was originally. That backfill stopped right about here. So from here up, there was a pretty steep slope up to the park. This was a famous road that you would walk up between the Dodgems and the carousel, and you'd see the roller coaster in the distance. It was a really interesting view. And then this gradual slope here came up, so there was a lower level to the merry-go-round just in this section because of the slope. Then here, where Kittyland is, this was a pretty severe drop-off. I remember it was a lot of fun when I was a kid riding the Cutie Caddy, little Cadillac cars, because at the end of the ride, it would swing you out right to the edge of this cliff. There were a couple little trees around there, but you could see right clear across to the parking lot on that side. It was a pretty thrilling view. So this is a pretty severe drop-off right here, but the rest of it is more of a gradual incline up. So I'll have to sand all this down, and that will be part 2. Stay tuned.